cost of producing food is going to go up significantly in Ireland and at EU level, and therefore, in practical terms, that has to be met and matched by support.
Hello and welcome to a very special AgriFocus budget special podcast today, where we're running through the announcement from Budget 2024, which was announced by the ministers in the Department of Finance, Michael McGrath and Paschal Donoghue, this afternoon. I'm joined now by agri-economist Ciaran Fitzgerald to run through, I suppose, the headline announcements from Budget 2024 today. Now, the finite detail of it will be announced by the Minister for Agriculture at his department tomorrow, but the overall headline figures in terms of tax and so on, we will go through today, and I've a bunch of paper here in front of me, so you'll have to forgive me if you hear a little rustling throughout the podcast as we just catch up on all the latest announcements. Ciaran, thank you very much for joining us today on the budget special.
You're welcome.
So first of all, I guess one of the things that farmers are wondering today is what benefits them in Budget 2024. And some of the things, I suppose, are in relation to the tax reliefs that have been continued on. So many of the tax relief for farmers have been extended and their overall value has increased. So this was announced by Minister for Finance, Michael McGrath. And he says that the consanguinity relief on stamp duty will be extended for 5 years. And that relief provides for a 1% rate of stamp duty to be applied on the transfer of agricultural land by sale or purchase, exchange or gift, if it's made to certain close relations, including a husband, a wife, a child, a stepchild, or even a nephew and a niece. And he also confirmed that the accelerated capital allowances for farm safety equipment would be extended. So this measure allows for accelerated capital allowances of 50% per annum, 50% per year over 2 years for certain eligible equipment. So McGrath went on to say in the Dáil today, Ciaran, that the government would increase the maximum aggregate lifetime limit of a number of farm-related tax reliefs to €100,000. Now, that is the maximum allowable aggregate relief under EU regulations. So essentially, in terms of the tax reliefs for farmers, we can go through it there and break it down into the stamp duty and so on. But essentially, it's a case of, as you were, they've just continued them on.
Yeah. At the same time, I think it's good that these reliefs have been extended and that they are up to the maximum. So, I think particularly the one that you mentioned earlier there, the investing in farm safety.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
and the maximisation of that. Look, it's important that whatever government can do on the tax side is both efficient and long-term. And I think what we're always asking for is an extension of reliefs so that people have a vision out 5 or 6 years rather than wondering from one budget to the next how long these things will last. All of that, I think, is very important. I suppose the other details that we're waiting, which have been signalled in relation to the suckler cow payments, the payments for yo, and the investment support for slurry. They haven't been formally announced yet. They're very important. I think, one thing about the budget is it's not the only day of the year in which agriculture needs support and gets support. But it's important in the overall scheme of things when we're talking about the Irish economy that agriculture is well, if you like, described, and its importance is acknowledged. And that has to be backed up by financial support. We're not in the motherhood and apple pie business. It has to be backed up by financial support. And we'll see. I mean, we were talking earlier, I think the department's resource allocation figure is down. We think that might be because there was a support scheme introduced last year for Ukraine in terms of potential supports for price changes that didn't happen.
Oh, just to let our listeners know, so the full allocation for the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine this year, so the year ahead, Budget 2024, is 1.9 billion, but the allocation was 2.1 billion for 2022. So a difference of 200 million there. And as you said, potentially that could have been connected to Ukraine and emergency funding last year.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that's interesting and the detail will be interesting is in the environmental side and in the sort of climate transition. There's been a lot of speculation and promise in regard to that area. So, I think as we look through the last year in particular at the discussions around the agriculture budget, the specific sectoral budgets, a lot has been talked about just transition. What we do know, I suppose, in the macro sense, is the cost of producing food is going to go up significantly in Ireland and at EU level, and therefore, for in practical terms, that has to be met and matched by support, because we don't think there's any appetite, for instance, to introduce formal price returns in the marketplace. That's politically not being talked about anywhere. But the consequence, if the price of producing food in the EU and Ireland goes up and there isn't some support for it, and then all that happens is less food is produced in a very carbon efficient region, and that's replaced by inefficiency. So we really need to see the colour of some of the environmental supports here.
Can I talk to you there about the cost of production or the cost of food going up? And it's something that you've talked about quite a lot before, Ciaran, and I've talked to you about it as well. When we look at it, so the Minister announced today that the average inflation rate is just over 5.25% for this year. And next year they're saying it'll be 2.9%. Last year, obviously, was significantly higher, I think 8% at one point there. So that's inflation. There was concerns with all of the measures that might come through in the budget today that it might contribute to this inflation in some way by providing people, I suppose, with more money in their pockets. In other words, inflation would go up, so it would be counteracting what the ECB is trying to do. But inflation and food inflation are very different things, because
Absolutely.
Food prices have not followed the trend of general inflation. Isn't that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yeah. I mean, the reality is that if you go back 10 years and between 2011 and 2021, the price of food actually fell in real terms. Grocery food prices fell. And we know that that's a big factor in terms of the economics of agriculture, that you're constantly being challenged to produce more, produce safer, and we're now being challenged to produce more with less environmental damage and less carbon, but there's no price return in the marketplace. We had 1 year of price inflation that sort of trickled into this year. Now, I think the reality is that food price inflation just last month was around the 6 or 7%, but it's coming down. We'd anticipate that next year that's not going to be outside the range. If the forecast for the rest of the economy is 2.9%, without some sort of energy shock, food prices will be in and around that. I think the key for us in the ag sector is, and this is where you're back to the question of supports for the cost, because we do know that the cost of producing food because of the Ukraine war, because of its impact on fertilizers, even though that might have come back somewhat, and the cost of feed has increased the cost of production quite significantly. We then have the regulatory side of it, which is saying, well, we want you to adopt a MAC curve, which people are doing. And again, agriculture and dairy farmers in particular are way ahead of everybody else, all of which is increasing costs. So there's a real question out there about what has been done to support farmers on the expenditure side.
Well, this is it. I suppose farmers will, as you said, have to have some sort of transition towards, and we were even speaking about it off air, as they say, Ciaran, in relation to, obviously the DAFN budget has gone down by 200 million this year, but we were wondering and be curious to know about the detail of the Department of Environment's budget allocation for 2024, and whether some of that funding will filter into the ag sector as well to help farmers, with that just transition.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's if you look at all the noise of the last 2 or 3 years, it's been about focusing on a more efficient, less environmentally damaging, etc., etc. And farming has got that. Irish farmers have got it. They're well on the road to it. But, the reality is costs are up quite significantly. We also have the potential in areas like anaerobic digestion for additional sources of income. So we really need to see proper financial support for the development of AD. And that's where, there's a slurry management issue around the nitrates, but there's also a slurry management issue around, properly functioning AD. It's been done in other countries, and what they've all done, back to the point you were making earlier about the tax reliefs, they put in long-term supports. And what we really need to see, again, in these other areas, whether it's solar or AD, or other forms of sort of waste to energy or alternative energy uses, we need to see long-term policy in there. So it'll be interesting to see in the environmental side what money is put in and how long-term it is.
Well, I might just run through a few of the head note or headline topics from the budget 2024, and some that we have more or less been confirmed will be in it, but the detail hasn't been announced until the Minister for Agriculture makes his announcement of the finer detail of the budget tomorrow. But there is supposed to be a €20 per ewe payment under the sheep improvement scheme. There's also supposed to be a €200 per suckler cow payment under SCEP, so that's the Suckler Carbon Efficiency Programme, and the National Beef Welfare Scheme, sort of getting the funding from both of those. There's also, I understand, an €8 million package for tillage farmers that's believed to be, in addition to the tillage exceptional aid payment. There's also supposed to be a grant coming through for up to 70% slurry storage, which is very important. And you mentioned it there, Ciaran, particularly with the nitrates derogation reduction that many dairy farmers are experiencing. They'll be very interested in that grant for the slurry storage. And there's also various different things in terms of the residential zoned land tax, I suppose, which are more peripheral to ag, but also affect many agricultural landowners as well. So a couple of other things then from Minister Michael McGrath's main speech. So he's the finance minister. In relation to the RZLT, he acknowledged that it's an important initiative to activate suitably zoned and service land for housing. So I suppose the idea behind the RZLT was to bring it in so that they could get land which is ideal for housing, which we have a major housing problem in this country, and try and get it into use for development. Of course, very many farmers who were affected by this got a bit worried, and they had land that was on maybe the suburb of a town or a city, and they wanted to be excluded because it was working agricultural land. But he today extended the liability date of the tax by 1 year to allow for the planned 2024 review of maps to take place, and to afford affected people such as farmers with a further opportunity to engage with the process. So they obviously saw the problems that were coming up from landowners like farmers, and they've addressed that. In terms of retirement relief, so in terms of succession, now there's obviously a different tax relief specific to ag, but overall retirement relief supports the intergenerational transfer of businesses and farms, according to the minister. So he said that in line with government policy on the age of retirement, he was extending the upper age limit for the relief from 65 until the age of 70. So the reduced relief was available on disposals from age 66 onwards, and now will apply from the age of 70. So those changes will come into effect from January 2025. So not next January, the following January, to allow for an appropriate transitional period. And he also said he'll introduce a limit on disposals to a child up to the age of 70. So that's just in relation to maybe if you're transferring the farm down to the younger generation. In terms of agricultural relief itself, and we mentioned it there just at the top of the podcast, Ciaran, he acknowledged in his speech, in fairness, that farming is the lifeblood of rural communities across Ireland. Now, a number of these agri-tax reliefs were due to expire at the end of this year. So that was the consanguinity relief and also the accelerated capital allowances. But as you mentioned, and he said it in his speech as well, the idea being that he's extending them so that they can plan. So like farmers need the financial support to know how they can plan into the future. Another thing, I mean, it might affect some farmers. I hope less and less farmers every year, but 20 cigarettes is now going to go up by 75 cents. So they're now up to a box of cigarettes for $16.75. Fair hole in your pocket there if you're a smoker. Maybe definitely worth considering.
Strong message there.
This is it, absolutely. And he also announced at the very start of his speech in the Dáil, and then he went into a little more detail on this infrastructure, climate and nature fund, which I thought was interesting. So he said the fund will grow incrementally by 2 billion for 7 consecutive years. So that's a total of 14 billion he's putting into this. And the first 2 billion contribution will come from the dissolution of the National Reserve Fund. So I really think he was saying with this particular fund about where they're aiming to go in terms of protecting nature, protecting climate, and, you know, putting their, like, pinning their collar to their colours to the mast, you know. And he said it's the aim of it is to help achieve the carbon budgets. Now, we know ourselves there is a reduction of 25% required by agriculture for our carbon budget. So I suppose that hopefully some of that climate and nature fund will trickle down again, maybe in an indirect way, to farmers. In terms of the environment side of things, Ciaran, and like maybe you can see it from another point of view of what they're doing in other countries as well. You know, this is our budget this year, but I'm sure they're doing budgets across the world in agricultural countries similar to ourselves. Are we allocating enough, would you say, in budgets in this country to help bridge that gap? I suppose you keep using the word just transition, but a just transition is bridging a gap between something being something now and something totally different in the very near future. There has to be something there to bridge and support the agri community, whether it's farmers all the way up to agribusiness.
Yeah. No, look, you know, we've had 3 years of a very nasty discussion, very unproductive discussion about environment and climate change in Ireland, which, you know, just became a row. And what needs to emerge and what just transition is about is to say, look, we are actually going to be producing livestock-based food in Ireland for the next 100 years. This notion that we can all become vegans, we can all produce veg, you know, it's based on a set of sort of almost quasi-religious beliefs. It's not going to happen. So the question then is, in the new agricultural production methodology that is linked to environmental impacts being diminished and linked to steadily lower emissions, what are the supports needed to make that probable and likely? And I think it's important that we've gone past this 3 years of the shrill bit into the one that says, look, 220,000 jobs in the food industry in Ireland and in the agricultural sector, 1 job in 10 in the economy. It's still going to be here, still going to be livestock based. It will achieve its capability, and these are the pragmatic ways in which the new elements are going to be arrived. I mean, I think you know, for a lot of people looking at the overall climate change thing, they mightn't relate to some of the nonsense that's talked or the way it's pilloried about, you know, carbon being sort of weaponized to attack agriculture. What we have is change management. You know, and people have worked in jobs and, you know, go back to the 80s, none of us had a computer on our desk. We went through change management. That was never accomplished by saying, you've been very stupid, you've been very pollutive, you're doing damage, blah, blah, blah. This is the new way. So you have to bring people into change management. Now, I think that's where we are. As I said, we've had the 3 years of very shrill non-debate. And hopefully, and I think the NESC report in June of this year was very important in that context. And the sort of, you know, the proof in the pudding piece will be the environmental supports here, and particularly as regards that fund, how realistic, how flexible, and how supportive that is. Because there is no doubt we can continue to support the 220,000 jobs. We can continue to produce very good meat and dairy products in Ireland for which there is world demand. And we will do that into the future with less environmental impact and lower emissions, providing there is support for it. So I think it's important that is the debate we talk about in terms of efficiency rather than the ideological debate, because that was nonsense.
And in terms of the lobby, I suppose, that was going to the budget, everybody lobbied the government before the budget just to make sure that they got their spake, I suppose, here on. Every department wanted to make sure that they got their allocation. And among that would have been number one, the Department of Environment, but number two, one of the coalition partners, the Green Party, and I'm sure they wanted to get their kind of allocation from the budget as well. And what I suppose I wonder, and from obviously it's early days, the budget was just announced, this afternoon, so we're just kind of coming to terms with it. But from your reading of the budget up to this point, we'll say today, of what you've seen of the overall minister's comments and so on, and the reaction that came out immediately afterwards, maybe from various parties or departments, would you say that you feel it's a budget that stands out as being orientated towards tackling climate? Or do you feel what they're kind of initially indicated in their speeches, that was climate has nearly taken a bit of a backseat on this particular budget, more in favour of the cost of living?
Yeah, well, you see, I think, you can argue and criticise the politicians that, we're 9 months away from an election, and therefore what you're seeing is a budget that is going to deal seriously with cost of living issues. And the concern of some people in the Green Party, and maybe some people even more extreme about climate change, is that's all been forgotten. I think if you go back to last year when the price of oil went through the roof, very pragmatically the government...
And fertiliser, yeah.
Yeah, but like very pragmatically the government supports people's central heating costs over Christmas. So there has to be pragmatism. And I think what the budget is... And there's a balancing act here, because you can only spend money that you've taxed and earned, and there has to be a balance between making sure the economy generates the tax money and the output and the economic activity on the one hand, and then that what is spent wisely. But what it also speaks to is that there has been a notion almost that we almost need to go take a step backwards into not the 20th century, the 19th, that industrial development can't take place anymore. Now that's how societies, economies break down. We have to, the adult approach to the cost of living, decarbonisation of the economy, the finance issue, food consumption and nutrition. The adult approach to that is we have to manage all of those things while keeping the economy going, as it is in other sectors. The energy sector has to continue to produce energy. And if we don't have, the renewable capability for 20 years, well, we still have to top up renewables, which are going to grow with alternative sources. We can't just turn off the lights. And the turn off the lights approach to ag, hopefully that nonsensical debate, which we had for the last 3 years, has matured, and we're now talking about let's be supportive, but let's be supportive in a realistic fashion. Let people who can produce very efficiently meat and livestock products in Ireland be well supported. And at the same time, I think the pragmatism around the cost of living is very important too, because there is a democracy at the heart of all of this, and people will only buy into that democracy if they're not left behind. And that's very important.
Would you be concerned that measures that are too targeted at cost of living could do more damage long term, in terms of, as I mentioned at the outset, in terms of global inflation, than good they do? Do you think it's a very political budget, in other words?
Well, there's always that judgment. And on the one hand, even I'd say if you look at the farm reliefs and the list of them, there was probably a case made everywhere for more. That any of those measures could have been doubled, according to what the farming community would say would really work. Similarly, with the cost of living piece, there is a scattergun approach. There's a reluctance in the Department of Finance, there always has been, to look at income-based supports so everybody gets them. And you'd argue that. But look, I think in overall sense, the macro approach is balanced. I think it was important to address the cost of living, as well as important to keep in focus the climate change challenges. But climate change will only be delivered through financial support for change. And the message I'd like to think that the government is getting and everybody's getting, you don't get change through shouting at people. You get it through a combination of education and financial support. And hopefully the balance here and the balance we're looking for from the Department of Environment has that correct balance between education and financial support.
Just to go back to a couple of measures again in Budget 24 today. I'll kind of pepper them throughout the podcast. Just you were speaking there about, well, not turning off the lights in ag, pardon the pun, but tax exemptions for electricity microgeneration are among the climate-related tax measures announced by Minister McGrath today. So he said he was doubling the tax disregard in respect of personal income received by households who sell residual electricity from microgeneration back to the national grid. So he said from January 2024, an income disregard of up to $400 a year will apply to profits or gains arising to a qualifying person from the microgeneration of electricity. This will provide relief from income tax, the USC and PRSI. And then he also mentioned in terms of electricity microgeneration, basically it's the small scale production of electricity by consumers or farmers, on farm or in their households, who generate electricity at their own homes for their own consumption. So a lot of the time, some farmers might invest in that for milking parlours, which obviously are big energy drain. And sell the excess electricity produced. Now, there was a major issue with farmers not being able to sell back to the national grid as well.
Yeah.
So that was difficult. But there's now going to be this increase from 200 to 400 in the exemption from the various taxes, income tax, USI and PRSI, as I mentioned. And then he also said in relation to the fund, he's going to extend the accelerated capital allowance scheme for energy efficient equipment for a further 2 years, which is good because I know a lot of farmers are investing in this more energy efficient equipment and climate friendly equipment as well. In terms of flat rate compensation for farmers, the government has confirmed that the flat rate compensation measure for farmers will decrease from 5% to 4.8% from January. So the decrease will save the government €18 million annually, according to the documents from the Department of Finance. And the flat rate addition compensates farmers who are not VAT registered or VAT incurred on their purchases. So that's an important one because there are, a significant number of farmers too who are not VAT registered.
There's no doubt.
And
that was last year was at 5.5. It was reduced last year too. So obviously that's something that the Department of Finance don't like.
Absolutely not. No. So it's the amount that unregistered farmers add to their price when supplying agri-produce or agricultural services to a VAT-registered business. So they cut it last year, as you said, from 5.5 to 5 and now back down to 4.8. And as you said, the department definitely don't like that. Again, going back to the farm safety equipment, which you welcomed there, the minister announced that the accelerated capital allowances for farm safety equipment would be extended. And it's also going to extend and increase the maximum aggregate lifetime limit of a number of farm-related tax reliefs to 100,000. That's up from 70,000. But 100,000 is the maximum, I think, allowable aggregate relief under EU regulation. Yeah. So also another important one, the land leasing income tax relief will be amended so that it only becomes available when the land has been owned for 7 years. So this is one that has really been sticking in the craw of farmers in recent months and over the last year, is investors coming in and buying up land. Now, we know dairy farmers in particular are going to need extra land to allocate for stocking limits under the nitrates derogation. Yeah. And they're being priced out. Well, they argue that they're being priced out by investors who are just coming in and whipping up land for development or whatever, Now, of course, you'll have like tillage farmers and other farmers there, they're being priced out by dairy farmers. So it's a vicious circle in many ways. But this is I suppose, you have to have owned the land for 7 years. So I would imagine this will stop the likes of big investors coming in. Yeah, exactly, Ciaran. So that's a welcome one for farmers. Just in terms then, I suppose, of the wider societal impact for farming families or rural families, the Minister Paschal Donoghue then, so he's the public expenditure minister, he came on and he announced a couple of things like an additional €200 will be paid to this year to the recipients of the living alone allowance. Of course, we have a lot of people in rural and farming communities who do live alone. There'll be support to those most in need. So there'll be a special once-off payment of €400 to be made before Christmas to those who receive carer support grant, disability allowance, blind pension, invalidity pension and domiciliary care allowance. There's also going to be an extension of the fee waiver on school transport. They had that before, so they obviously are continuing on that. Then in terms of farm families, if you have children, you're getting children's allowance. So they're going to increase it from €4 to 46 per week for under 12s and €54 per week for over 12s. Parents' benefit as well will also be extended to 9 weeks from August 2024. And a new thing is they're extending the child benefit payment to 18-year-olds in full-time education. So sometimes you will have a Leaving Cert student who's still 18 and they're still in school, but they previously didn't get the children's allowance once they hit 18. So that'll help with their school costs, no doubt. So those were primarily the main ones. Now, Minister Paschal Donohoe did say he was providing 67 million for the craft apprenticeship system to over 16,000 places next year. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of apprenticeships are included in that. It's towards kind of housing, but there are a lot of rural people who like to get into apprenticeships rather than going the college route.
I think that speaks to the notion that, not everybody wants to do third level university, and we have a deficit of people on the craft side. So I think that's an important step. Absolutely.
And then we were just mentioning earlier, putting the money where the mouth is. If you want to get this just transition in environment, you have to put in support measures. So he has said in terms of climate action, and this is Minister Paschal Donohoe, he said he will accelerate community-based partnerships to deliver energy savings. There'll also be funding for solar supports that will allow households to profit by selling electricity back to the grid. There'll also be a new low interest loan scheme that'll work alongside the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland to allow everyone the opportunity to benefit from energy savings. And then he went on to say that the likes of farms can still go for the existing schemes, which are to get solar. There's already 70,000 solar panels on 70,000 buildings across the country. So they're just saying, farmers, you're entitled to that as well. In terms of the carbon tax, I think you mentioned it there earlier. He announced 165 million of carbon tax revenues will be available next year to support this just transition. There's the phrase, and address fuel poverty, bringing the total carbon tax revenue available to 788 million. So he said an additional 32 million in carbon tax funding will be provided to the Department of Agriculture next year to support 50,000 farmers to improve biodiversity, climate, air and water quality outcomes.
Now, 32 million divided by 50,000 is not
Your
huge.
maths would be quicker than mine now.
Well, it's not a very large number, but look, I think it's important. I think, one of the points that's worth considering in this macro issue is if you look at what's happened in the last month in the UK, the Tory Prime Minister has decided to abandon a lot of their decarbonisation targets because he felt that politically there wasn't buy-in. And we talked about just transition a lot, but I think, and we did, we've talked about the shrill characterisation of ag a lot. I mean, ultimately, I think it's important that this budget is balanced. It's important it's properly resourced because everybody, including farmers, want to continue with the targets we've set ourselves in climate change. We don't want to have to abandon them. And it won't be farmers that would actually abandon them. But you can see in the UK one, you might argue that it's sleight of hand. But the popular support for the achievement of target goals diminished when the cost of living took off. And people are saying, well, I didn't mind aspiring to that when I had a decent income, but I'm not going to follow through with it. So that is the bigger picture here. They have to continue to make the transition affordable, and it has to be supportive to areas like agriculture, where you're effectively saying, we want you to continue, which is good, but we want your cost base has gone up, and your prices of inputs is going to go up significantly. There needs to be compensation for that. And that's what you get with just transition. And that means you're on track to continue to reach your carbon goals. And I think that's very important.
And finally, can I say to you then, Ciaran, in terms of the budget, you said there, the financial supports have to be there for a just transition, if people are looking at this budget and saying it's more cost of living funding than climate targeted measure funding, is the responsibility on the national government in their national budget to demonstrate that financial support for climate or just transition? Or does it come from Europe? So does it have to be more of a move made by Europe to try and... Now, obviously, the funding for DAFM here in this particular budget, much of it comes from CAP anyways, from Europe. But whose responsibility is it? So, as you said there in the UK, the situation, the political will seemed to wane there in somewhat, and he quickly changed, tack on that particular one. I mean, even though Europe wants us, and we have like the COPs, COP28, COP27, the UN sustainability conferences that take place where people make commitments. They have the Paris Accord and so on. I mean, when it comes down to money or nature, do you think that there is going to, like, as you said there, I think you kind of alluded to it yourself in terms of how are you going to get that balance? Because at the moment, I think people talk a lot about nature, but they're not willing to put their money where their mouth is. So we all do. I don't think there is a person who doesn't want to protect the earth and make sure it's here for our kids, grandkids and great grandkids and so on. But who is willing to pay for it?
Yeah, and look, it's important that the government has a surplus. We're fortunate that we have the economic model we have, which I continue to say includes a very significant ag-food industry that has a surplus and that is prepared to spend it in a balanced way. And if last year's budget was more about climate change than cost of living, this year's is clearly about cost of living. Now, whether that's political vicissitudes or just, I think, reality, I think it's important. The EU element, I think, is needs a rethink. I mean, one of the concerns with the European Commission, God bless them, is they're about 20 years behind the sort of political philosophy in the member states. And I say this as being a supporter of it. But the cap at the moment is a cap that was designed in the sort of year 2000 to 2010, when the WTO was the biggest show in the world, and the whole question being asked of agriculture was, you need to get rid of your tariffs. Now, WTO has almost gone. My point would be, CAP has always been asked to do more with less money. So we just need, again, like the just transition bit, a realization that if the EU as well as our national government wants us to be biodiverse producers, low environmental impact producers and low carbon producers, and the EU is not prepared to have a price adjustment mechanism at its supermarket level, practically, and it isn't, then it needs to put its money securely into the cap, and it needs to be a focused money or a focused amount of expenditure that, if you like, compensates and rewards for carbon efficiency, for environmental efficiency, and for biodiversity efficiency. So, we just need to have a debate very quickly. And my concern is always that the CAP and the EU changes very, very slowly. They're still coming out of globalization, and they haven't really copped on, if they, to use the term, that, transition in agriculture required significant targeted funding.
Indeed, very, very true. Well, that's all we have time for on this budget special of AgriFocus. Just to give you a quick synopsis, the fuel excise rise has been postponed, so it will come in next year, but don't worry, the pumps are not going to go up tonight. Also, just to let you know some of the responses, I know the ICMSA have said budget 2024 is a pretty much non-event. MACRA is a bit disappointed at the omission of a specific succession scheme in budget 2024, but as myself and Ciaran mentioned earlier, it would be very interesting to see the finer detail of what will come out, particularly in the environment budget tomorrow. That will come out as the week goes on, and the various ministers go into the checks and balances of their own department's budget, and we can see, but we have kind of the overall ones of the sheep payment, the suckler payment, the slurry storage payment, and indeed a tillage payment as well, which will probably become more apparent tomorrow once we speak to the minister. That's all for the AgriFocus budget special. Thanks for listening. Please do rate and review the podcast, and stay tuned to Agriland for all the latest updates on budget 2024.